Hi, I'm Saskia van Nauhuis, and I'm a professor of ecology at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science. And today I'm going to give a lecture about plant-animal interactions. Now, we might think it's a little strange because there's no other lectures in this course that are taxa specific. So this is a lecture that's sort of centered around plants. In fact, we could think of it as plant ecology and plant-animal interactions. But there's some reasons why there's this taxa centered lecture. And so one of the reasons is that plants, including algae in the water, is the primary for sort of first trophic level and the primary producers over all of the earth, and they're what makes our oxygen. And so plants are extremely important if we just think about the ecology of life on earth. A second reason is because plants are actually quite different than animals, and we're animals, and so we think about animals a lot, and it's important to think about plants and sort of the difference, their different evolution and the factors that are happening in their lives as live organisms. So what we'll talk about today is a little bit about the evolutionary origin and diversity of plants, plants as food for other organisms, the specific types of associations that plants have with other animals, so herbivory, pollination, and seed dispersal, and then just briefly about sort of the phenomenon, the very important evolutionary phenomenon of plant-animal coevolutionary diversification. So all ecological processes and patterns are made much more interesting if we stick them into the context that they evolved in. And this is definitely true about plants. So here on the side is a timeline going back to at the oldest on this timeline is 4,500 million years ago when the Earth was formed versus up to the present day. So if we look at this timeline, plants evolved about 900 million years ago. And they evolved in the water as algae, and then they moved on to the land about 450 million years ago. And once they were on the land, then the land plants that are familiar to us evolved. But way before plants evolved, photosynthesis, so using light energy to power cells, was going on in bacteria and things that are sort of like bacteria. And so you can see that photosynthesis was going on for hundreds of millions of years, just a very long time, before there were even eukaryotes. And then once there were eukaryotes, then eventually plants evolved. So photosynthesis and using light energy to power things has been going on for a long time. But it isn't the first energy source that any organisms used. So before using light energy, there was other kinds of chemical energy and heat energy that were used to power cells. Okay, so after the plants evolved and came onto the earth, arthropods came at about the same time out of the water onto the earth. So arthropods originally also came from the water, and they haven't been around as long as plants in the water, but they came onto the earth about when plants came onto the earth. I mean, onto the land, terrestrial land. But the earliest animals of any type on the earth was 700 million years ago. So there was animals in the water, and then arthropods came onto the earth about when plants did. And that's important when we think about the evolution of plants in association with the things that eat them. Then if we look at flowering plants, they're quite new. So this green is sort of the time period that plants have been around, then they came onto the earth, onto the terrestrial environment, and then flowering plants evolved 100, 200 million years ago. And along with flowering plants was the evolution of the insects that pollinated them. So flowering plants, angiosperms, are plants that have flowers that attract insects for sexual reproduction of the plant. Okay, so now let's think about this period of time when plants are evolving from the common ancestor of plants. Okay, so the origin of green plants. So I mentioned to you already that there already was symbiosis. There already was photosynthesis. And so it's thought that there was a eukaryotic single-celled organism that was a heterotroph, meaning that it eats other things, so sort of a predatory organism which had flagella. And at some point it took up, maybe it tried to eat or something, a cyanobacterium-like prokaryote that was photosynthetic. And I guess sometimes it would not get killed when it got eaten and would continue to photosynthesize inside of the belly of the thing that ate it. And gradually, over a really long period of time, a symbiotic relationship started to evolve between the photosynthetic cyanobacterium prokaryote and the eukaryote that engulfed it. And so we think that photosynthesis in eukaryotes, so in plants, evolved as the result of a symbiotic relationship between a cyanobacteria and a heterotrophic eukaryotic organism. And so that was sometime between 1,500 million years ago and 700 million years ago that happened. It's not really clear. Okay, so then that happened at some point. And then from that evolved two different lineages of algae. And so one lineage of algae, shown up here in the blue, is very diverse and old and is mostly in marine environments, so in the salt water. And these ones have stayed almost exclusively, but not quite, aquatic. And many of them are single-celled, but not quite all. Another lineage went off in the freshwater. And this lineage has organisms that are multicellular and single-cell. And relatively late on the lineage, so evolving recently, are the land plants. So from this lineage came the land plants. But we should remember all the time when we think about sort of the diversity of plants, and plants including algae, that the vast majority of the diversity and of the evolutionary history is in the state of being relatively simple, often single-cell algae. Okay, let's see, I think I sort of said this. So one huge lineage of algae is mostly marine, one is mostly freshwater, and land plants about 450 million years ago evolved from the freshwater ones. Okay, so let's think just a little bit more about algae before we get to land plants. So they're photosynthetic protists, mostly aquatic, but they're not all aquatic now. There's some algae that grows, say, on the bark of trees and things like that. It's not all out in the water. They can be single-celled or multicellular, but they don't have a vascular system, so that's different than, say, a tree. They're in oceans, rivers, lakes, anywhere where there is water, and they produce over half the planet's oxygen. So it's over half the planet's oxygen because if we think about the oceans and all of the sort of layer of the ocean that receives light, so when you get down deep you can't have photosynthetic protists because there's not enough light, but the layer of the water that receives the light is quite huge if we think of the whole Earth, and so it makes sense that then they're producing so much of the world's oxygen. Okay, some examples of some algae. Look at all the morphological and differences in complexity. And then I'm including this picture to show you that some algae, so water plants, are huge. So this is an example of a kelp forest in the shallow water. of the sea. And for scale, here's a seal. And so algae doesn't have to be little teeny things. All right, now we're moving on to plants on the land. So once plants came onto the land, they evolved first in response to the physical environment, and then later in response to organisms, other organisms that they were interacting with on the land. But if we just think about the physical environment, one of the things that they evolved is vascular tissue. So you can imagine a plant comes on the land, it has to change morphologically from when it was in the water because it can't lose all, it would die if it lost all of its water due to evaporation. So it has to be kind of enclosed in something that's waterproof. And then, but nonetheless, it needs to get water to all of its cells, and it needs to get nutrients around in all of its cells. And so when it's not in the aquatic environment, then vascular tissue evolved. And so that vascular tissue moves the nutrients and water moves the water and nutrients from the soil to the upper part of the plants, and it moves the sugars that are made through photosynthesis from the leaves into the roots and also to the rest of the plant so that it can grow and have energy to do things. So vascular tissue evolved once they were on land. And here's an example of a fern which exists now, but is what we think of as what the early plants with vascular tissue looked like. A second thing that evolved was lignin, which is in the cell walls of plants. So plants already had cellulose in the cell walls. And then in addition to the cellulose, they also have added lignin, which for one thing aids in making plants cells waterproof so that water doesn't evaporate out of it. And then also it turns out, although this evolution happened before herbivory probably, it's also difficult for many organisms to digest. So lignin got added to the cellulose of the cell walls. So another thing that happened is that plants evolved roots. So in the sea, large algae, like those kelps, they have sort of anchors to the bottom so that they don't float around, but they don't have roots. Roots is a different thing. Roots do function for many plants to anchor them, keep them from blowing away, and also keep them in place. But they also, but their main function, a very important function, is that they absorb water and nutrients from the soil, and they store sugars that the plant has made through photosynthesis. So they get things from the soil, and what the photosynthate in the leaves is stored down in the roots. And so this is an example of a root that's sort of dominated by storage and a root that's dominated by surface area to absorb things from the soil. All right, so of course other factors became important once plants got onto land. So the problem the issue of there not being water around the cells, so the cells have to be waterproof. There's other issues. For example, for sexual reproduction, gametes can't, say, swim around in the air, and so the morphology and the form of the gametes had to change in order to survive in an air environment. And so there was evolution of spores initially, like in ferns, and pollen and seeds, which are sort of for sexual reproduction, and then dispersal after sexual reproduction in an air environment. So that's one aspect of it. So sexual reproduction and dispersal in the air environment caused lots of changes in morphology and sort of life history. And also the terrestrial environment is both warmer than a lot of the ocean, and also the temperatures fluctuate much more than in the ocean, and there's higher UV radiation because it's not filtered out by the water. This increases the mutation rate of DNA. So when there's higher UV and more fluctuation in temperature and higher temperatures, then the mutation rate is higher. So it is thought that one of the reasons that that higher plants have a sporophytic and a gametophytic generation is because the sporophytic generation, which is the dominant generation in these plants. So for example, in higher plants, say this tree and this angiosperm tree, this whole tree is the sporophytic generation, and it's diploid, so it has two versions of each gene, and it has some mechanisms for gene repair, so it's resistant to really negative effects of mutation. So there's the sporophytic generation, and then there's this much smaller gametophytic generation that's haploid, and so that would be the seed. Well, the seed is diploid, but so the seed is the gametophytic generation, and then the egg and pollen. Okay, so it's thought that this dominant sort of dominant life of the sporophytic generation is as an adaptation to higher mutation rate on land than in the water. Okay. All right, so these are adaptations that happen because of the physical environment, but to plants when they moved on to land. All right, so now as in the water, so both in the water and on land, plants are eaten. They're the primary producers, and they're eaten by the heterotrophs, the things that eat already existing life. So let's look at plants as food in the water first. So plants as food in the water are algae. Much of them are single cells or a few cells that are in the water column, or they're on the surface of the sand or the rocks. And these are eaten by zooplankton, which are also in the water column. They're eaten by small fish. So this is a picture of a school of sardines. And sardines are, little fish that eat phytoplankton. Crustaceans, clams, snails, sea urchins, lots of different things in the sea eat them. This is a picture showing a mussel, and it's filter feeding. And so it's actually, this is the zooplankton and phytoplankton that are in the water, and they get sucked in, and then both of the zooplankton and the phytoplankton are taken up, so they're omnivores. And then the water is shot out again. And so they just sort of filter this water and take out phytoplankton and zooplankton. All right, so that's how so some of the ways that algae are eaten in the water. Okay, so what about plants as food on the land? So first we'll just think about humans. So humans eat all parts of the plant, leaves, fruit. We like fruit, both sort of sweet fruit and savory fruit. The pods, so that's also the fruit, but it's the fruit in a different form. We eat the flowers. We eat the seeds. These pictures show some seeds, but also wheat, millet, lots of things. We eat a lot of seeds as grain and beans and pulses. We eat some stems. And then we eat various kinds of roots. So we eat these tap roots that have a big sugar storage part of them. We eat these rhizomes, which are another form of roots. And then we eat bulbs, which is sort of like stem underground, say onions and garlic. So we eat all the different parts of plants. Also, other organisms eat all the different parts of plants too. So this is like we're not really any different than any other organisms who eat plants. Okay, but there's some other things that other organisms eat that we don't focus on when we're eating. And so one of those two of those are xylem and phloem. So xylem and phloem are the fluids that go in the vascular tissue of plants. Xylem is water and minerals that come up from the soil and go up into go through the roots and go into the plant, because the plant needs the waters and minerals. And then the phloem goes both up and down, and the phloem moves around the sugars and other things that the plant makes throughout the plant, through the different parts of the plant. So say photosynthate from the leaves goes into the roots for storage, and it also goes up into the growing tip for energy and for growth. Okay, so there's xylem and phloem that plants have. And insects, some insects eat either xylem or phloem. So this is a picture of an aphid, and it's feeding on phloem. And so it has its mouth parts are specialized into a stylet. This is ST stylet, which wiggles between cells until it gets to the phloem tube. And then the phloem tube is under pressure. So as soon as it pierces the phloem tube, the phloem flows up into the aphid. Since the phloem is under high pressure, so it goes. The phloem comes out of the plant through the aphid, and then is actually more than the aphid can deal with. And so the aphid, the phloem comes out of the aphid in the form of honeydew. So it goes in the stylet and then goes out the back end of the aphid in these little droplets. So the extra phloem that the aphid can't do anything with comes out, and that has a lot of sugars in it, and so other insects feed. Actually, and not just insects, but other organisms feed on that phloem, which we call honeydew once it comes out of the aphid. And in fact, many ant species sort of tend to the aphids. So you can think of them as sort of having a farming of the aphids to eat the honeydew. And so in exchange for getting the honeydew, the ants protect the aphids from their enemies. And so it's a mutualistic relationship. The ants get the honeydew and the aphids get protection from their enemies. Xylem is also food. Xylem doesn't have nearly as much nutrients in it, but it has a lot of nutrients in it and has a little bit of sugar in it. And so there's other sucking insects. Here's a cicada, and if you look right here, this is this is where it's piercing into this wood, into the xylem, and it's feeding on the xylem. And this is even more dilute food than the phloem, but nonetheless it is food that is eaten. So xylem and phloem are both low nutrient food sources. Phloem has a lot of sugars in it, but it has very few amino acids. There's not much, and there's not much nitrogen at all. And so in order to deal with that, aphids and other insects that eat phloem have nutritional symbionts. And so in aphids, there's specialized cells or even groups of cells that harbor symbiotic bacteria. And these symbiotic bacteria synthesize the missing amino acids for the aphids. So this is a symbiosis. The aphids get the amino acids that they need, and the bacteria get somewhere to live, and they get a source of sugars for their own upkeep. Many other insects have symbionts to help them use low nutrient food. And another example is termites. So termites eat wood. And so some termites actually live in wood, and some termites live in soil structures that they build. And termites have actually, okay, so when I talked about, in the aphid, the symbionts live within these specialized cells, and actually they're transmitted from mother to offspring. So babies are born with this symbiont. Termites have a slightly different arrangement. They have their symbionts living in their gut. And so when they're born, they don't actually have any symbionts, but they pass this on through eating each other's feces. And so they just, within the nest, they just pass on the symbionts, so every individual has it. And in this case, they are using the symbionts to digest cellulose. So wood is primarily cellulose, again, really low density of nutrients. And so it's sort of community of protists that are the symbionts feed on, help break down the cellulose into fatty acids that then the termite can use. So they have these endosymbionts inside their body. They also have symbionts in the sense that, especially in these soil nests, they cultivate a fungus, and then that fungus, they eat the fungal spores, and they also eat the wood that the fungus breaks down. So they bring in they bring in dead wood, and then the fungus eats it, and they eat the fungus, and they eat the semi-digested wood. And so that's also a symbiotic relationship, but it's not endosymbiont. Okay. So I sort of slipped there into talking about different ways that organisms eat plants. So I'll talk about some more of those. So we know that there's grazers. And so grazing, say lots of vertebrates graze, is when the sort of above ground part of the plant is eaten, but it's not killed. But a lot of the whole above ground part of plants can be eaten. And the way that plants can defend themselves against grazing is by having, say, grasses have abrasive silica in the tissue, and that is hard on the teeth of the grazers. So that's one form of defense. They don't have a lot of chemical defense. And another form of defense is that most of their biomass is stored in the roots. And so if the whole above ground part gets eaten, the plant doesn't die. So that's a way that they persist over time. Other plants are eaten through browsing. So here's this elephant who's browsing. So it's when when an animal sort of eats leaves or eats sometimes leaves and branches off of a plant, but they don't consume all of the whole plant, the whole above ground part of the plant. So the defense against browsing is usually thorns or tannins, which are very difficult to digest in the leaves. So in this picture we see a goat who's feeding on an acacia, very carefully trying to eat between the thorns, which are the defense. And so these thorns, they're not just sharp and difficult to eat around, but they also house ants. So this is a picture, and so the plant does two things. The acacia plant does two things that attract and keep ants on it. One thing is that it has these thorns, which at the base of the thorns, the ants can actually live inside of the thorn. And then also they make these food bodies at the base of the leaves. And here's an ant who's feeding on these little food gift from the plant. And so the acacia plants keep these ants on them. And so what you see with this goat now, if you look closer, is it's trying to avoid the thorns as it gets some of the green acacia leaves, and it's actually being swarmed by ants onto its face at the same time. So the plant is using its own thorns and also using the ants as a defense against this browsing herbivory. Okay, a lot of herbivory is due to insects. And so the classic ones we think about are leaf chewers like caterpillars, and the defense against these are usually chemical defenses or tannins. So chemical defenses that are deterrent or toxins, or tannins or other things which are difficult to digest. Another extremely common kind of insect herbivore that we don't really think about that much because it's teeny are leaf miners. So here is the leaf miner, here is the adult. The adult laid an egg somewhere over here. It ate within the leaf, and then the pupa of this moth is right here, and it's going to pupate eventually and become a moth like this. And so leaf miners are super common, just really small, but if you go outside you'll see leaf mines no matter what. And the defense against them is toxins, but another defense against them is simply dropping a leaf if it's been infested by a lot of leaf miners. We talked about aphids already that are eating phloem on the stem. Those are very common. Another really interesting category of insects that eat plants are gallers, and so these are insects. They could be flies or they could be wasps. Usually that's or Lepidoptera, which induce the plant to make a gall. And that gall is often nutritive for the developing offspring, and sometimes it's also just a shelter for both the adults and the offspring. And so this fly makes this, fly makes this plant make these yellow galls that it lays eggs in, and they develop in there. So remember, wood is not a very nutritive type of food, but there are still wood-boring insects. And sort of one characteristic of wood-boring insects is they take a really long time to grow up. So it's probably because they're eating something that's so low nutrients. So this is an example of the emerald ash borer, which is a forest pest. And it lays eggs on the trunk of a tree. The eggs hatch, and over a period of years, the larvae develop and then eventually leave as adults. Okay, so the defenses that I talked about in these examples are direct defenses. Things, or most of them are. I guess I talked about the ants. That was indirect. Most of the ones I talked about are direct defenses that the plant has against what's feeding on it. Plants also, and so these would be toxins, chemical toxins and repellents, the way they distribute their nutrients to avoid having important parts eaten, waxy covers, trichome hairs. These are direct defenses. There's also indirect defenses. And so that's shown here as these natural enemies. So a natural enemy of an herbivore would be a predator, could be an insect predator, could be a bird, or a parasitoid, which is a parasitic, usually wasp or fly, which which feeds on these herbivores. Okay, so one type of indirect defense is emitting volatile chemicals that are attractive to the natural enemies. So the classic way we think of it is that a plant, when it's being fed on, either intentionally or sort of just as a function of cells breaking, release volatile compounds, and these volatile compounds are attractive to parasitoid wasps. So parasitoid wasps are seeking these volatile compounds, and then they come to them and they find the damaged plant and they find the herbivore that they want to parasitize. Another kind of indirect defense is one that I already mentioned earlier with the ants, which is having food bodies or ectrophoral nectaries or domatia. So these are sort of structures and food sources which once enemies of their herbivores come to the plant, the plant keeps them there. So domatia are little like structures in the leaves or the stem, which are safe for, say, predatory mites or other kinds of arthropods to live in, and then they patrol around on the plant and they kill herbivores. So plants can defend themselves directly, and they can defend themselves indirectly by attracting enemies of herbivores. Okay, so the other associations that I'm just going to mention briefly that plants have with animals are pollination, which we talked about before. And one thing to keep in mind about pollination is, say, 85 to 95% of flowering plants, angiosperms, are pollinated by some kind of animals. And if they're not pollinated by animals, then they're self-pollinating, meaning they evolved from something that pollinated by animals, but they just do it themselves. Or some of them are wind-pollinated. But not all plants are angiosperms. So I just want to mention gymnosperms, which are something like 5% of plants, but actually cover quite a lot of the area. And so these are conifers and cycads and ginkgos, but conifers are very common if you go in the mountains. And these ones are wind-pollinated, so they're not considered flowering plants. They aren't angiosperms, and so most of them are wind-pollinated, with a few that are pollinated by insects. The other type of association that plants have with animals is through seed dispersal. So seeds are dispersed by the wind, by animals, by water, by bursting, and by and these days by humans moving them around. And so, as you can see from this picture, the morphology of fruit and seeds, so the seed and the fruit around them, and the behavior, what does it do, vary greatly depending on the dispersal mode. So coconuts float, and witch hazel seeds, like the sort of place around the seeds dries up and the seed goes shooting out as the configuration changes. So that kind of thing. And in this category here, seeds that are dispersed by animals, they also have specialized types of morphology. So the one we think about the most is when the seed is surrounded by a fruit which tastes good, and then animals consume that, and then they move away, and then they defecate, and the seed is still viable in their poop, and so that's a way that and by moving around, they disperse the seeds. But there's also seeds that are carried away and buried. So say like squirrels carry seeds around and bury them, and then they grow from where they were buried. And then there's seeds that hitchhike on the body. And so these would be prickly seeds, which get attached to your socks if you go walking in the grass. And so these, in this case, the animals are not intentionally carrying them around. In fact, they might kind of wish they didn't have them. Okay, so these are the modes of dispersal by animals. So these modes of dispersal, if we think a little bit, the fruit ones and the burying ones are sort of advantageous to both the plant and the animal, whereas the hitchhiker one is mostly just advantageous to the plant. Okay. So one of the things that is really evident whenever you think about plant-animal interactions is the process of coevolutionary diversification. So coevolution is the reciprocal evolution between interacting pairs of species or interacting groups of species. And that reciprocal evolution can be antagonistic or mutualistic. So it can be interacting in a negative way or in a positive way. So it's clear if we look on the large macro evolutionary scale that coevolution occurs, in the sense that there's corresponding radiation of taxonomic groups. So as plants became more diverse, insects became more diverse. And so that is evidence of coevolution. But if you try to look in detail for evidence of coevolution, where you see reciprocal sort of response to selection by the two species, it's often really hard to see. So if you sort of stand back and look at the pattern, then you see coevolution. But if you look close, you can't, it's really difficult to prove. So 3 large-scale macroevolutionary coevolution stories exist in plant-animal interactions. One is between flowers and pollinators, and this is a mutualistic interaction, which we've discussed several times. A second one is plant chemical defense, and this is an antagonistic relationship. So a plant evolves chemical defense. Say it evolves iridoid glycosides, like that are in mustard and broccoli, and then attacks some taxonomic group, overcomes that, and then it radiates on all of the plants that have that chemical defense because it's safe there from competitors. And then the plants evolve another chemical defense, and so on and so on. And so that's an antagonistic form of coevolution, which has led to diversity of plants and animals. Third is seed dispersal. So as I showed you in that picture, seeds are dispersed in lots of ways, not by animals, and not all animal dispersal is a coevolution. But some animal dispersal probably is a coevolution. So plants evolve fruits that taste good to attract dispersers, and dispersers evolve to be specialized on particular fruit. And so the evidence of coevolution is looking again at the pattern of diversification of fruit traits that corresponds directly with the associated evolution of fruit-feeding animals. And so here's a cute example of a lemur eating an orange fruit. And lemurs are red-green colorblind, which means that they're only attracted to fruit of some very narrow colors. And in Madagascar, and lemurs are only found in Madagascar. And so so fruit color has evolved differently in Madagascar than it has other places because of limitations of lemur vision. Okay. So what we covered. Plants originated long after photosynthesis did as a result of a symbiotic association between something that photosynthesized and a eukaryote. Once plants came onto a land, they involved some new complexity, such as being vascular and eventually having flowers. And this new complexity was both due to the physical environment and due to the animals with which the plants were interacting. I talked about specific associations between plants and animals, so herbivory, eating plants, defense against herbivory, pollination and seed dispersal. And then I talked just very briefly about these as sort of archetypal examples of macroevolutionary evidence of coevolution, and more generally, this coevolution as driving diversity, both in the animals and in the plants that the animals are associating with. All right, that's all. Thank you.